You're listening to the Place Northwest podcast, your digital resource for the latest insight and analysis on all things property in the northwest of England. Listen when you want, where you want.
Hello and welcome to this Place Northwest podcast, kindly sponsored by wirral-based architecture firm Paddock Johnson. I'm your host, Dan Whelan, and today I'm joined by Simon Halliwell, Director of Paddock Johnson, and Steve Grimster, Director of Cheshire-based planning firm Grimster Planning. Hello to you both.
Hi, Dan.
Afternoon, Dan.
Today we're going to be talking about the proposed planning reforms. The current system has been deemed unfit for purpose. The planning reforms are aimed at simplifying and speeding up the current planning process. We're going to be talking about the impact that's going to have on architecture and Robert Jenrick's vision of beautiful buildings. Simon's going to provide insight into that, and Steve is going to provide insight into the planning side of the argument. So Simon, we'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about Paddock Johnson and the work that you do and what you're currently working on.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Paddock Johnson, a firm of architects who are based in Port Sunlight on the Wirral. Port Sunlight being really one of the exemplar settlements that has been built in the last, I suppose, 150 years. An exemplar in terms of housing and community space, public space. We get involved in an awful lot of housing as part of our day-to-day, as well as we deal a lot in conservation, which is helpful being based here as well. And in-house, we also have health and safety and building surveying. So, a lot of what we're working on at the moment, large housing schemes, small housing schemes, infill developments, right across a number of councils across the north of England, very much with a focus on delivering design-conscious developments which suit the places that they are.
Excellent. And Steve, tell us a little bit about your consultancy and the work that you do.
Well, I established Grimster Planning 12 months ago now, last September. That was after working in Manchester for 14 years for property and planning consultancy practices. And similar to Simon, really, most of my work is in the residential sector. So house building and also sort of extra care as well. And a lot of work also in the affordable housing sector. A mix of work over sort of the north of England and also North Wales. And again, similar to Simon, greenfield sites down to sort of redevelopment of brownfield land and brownfield land in the Greenbelt.
Excellent. And as is the way of the world these days, we're all recording this podcast from different locations. I'm in Salford. Simon, you're at your office in Port Sunlight, as you mentioned, and Steve, you're in Tarporley in Cheshire. And I think, Simon, you mentioned there about your office in Port Sunlight and how that development is sort of an exemplar and possibly something that we could see more of in the future, but we'll come to that later on. Just tell us a little bit about the history behind Port Sunlight.
Yeah, very quickly. It's special for many reasons, really. It was sort of a vision of a model settlement for the workers of Lever Brothers, or what's Lever Brothers now. The factory, which is located right next to the village, and it's very much a village which was master planned initially by Lord Leverhulme and his team of architects, but really has grown organically, dependent on the success of the Lever factory, really, and it started to be built in the 1880s. Our actual office is the converted schoolhouse, which was the original school on the village, and as the village grew, it's up to 900 houses, I think, now. They built a bigger school further down into the centre of the village. Really, there's absolutely everything here you could possibly need, or there was when it was built. Some things have been changed slightly since then, but it was built with a pub, albeit it was a temperance pub at the beginning, which it isn't now, and it had its own shops, open space, its own auditoria, its own outdoor pool, and places you could, really enjoy everything about living, in a community. And we must remember that a lot of the people who lived here initially would have come from slums, effectively, back-to-back houses. we take this for granted now, but it really is a wonderful place to be based. And I lived here myself for 10 years. And I think this sort of semi-organic growth of developments is something which is very much restricted by planning policy now. And this led us to start to think about the current planning system really, and how it would be applied in many ways to Port Sunlight now.
Yeah, so it sounds like a sort of an idyllic place to live and to work. Um, we've spoken in the weeks leading up to this podcast about how under the current planning system, Port Sunlight wouldn't exist.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
could you elaborate on that a little bit and why that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of talk about design guides in relation to the emerging planning policy through this white paper that was released. And you sort of think, well, Port Sunlight itself doesn't fit a design guide. There's no design guide which would lead to the creation of a village and a community such as Port Sunlight. It's a mixture of everything. It's a mixture of styles. It's a mixture of land use. It's a mixture of public and private space. And something that the day-to-day sort of planning guidance that we deal with, things such as interface distances, garden sizes and dimensions, all now seem to be set in stone. And what Port Sunlight has always done is it trades off some of those things against, say, having allotments instead of a huge garden. It has public open space and community facilities instead of providing private open space. And it's sort of typified by what we call housing blocks, really. They're sort of U-shaped or O-shaped blocks of housing, which are very high density. But then this is offset again against, it's actually quite space hungry because of the amount of open space. But it's very much unique, and I think that's something which maybe current planning policy doesn't, I suppose, encourage.
Yeah.
is the best way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the words that crops up a lot in my job, and I'm sure your job as well, is placemaking. And the features that you mentioned there, the pub, the auditoriums, the allotments, it very much sounds like Port Sunlight, even though it was developed so many years ago, had that placemaking at its heart. It provided everything for the residents living there. And if we think now about the sort of the volume, some of the volume house builders and the big estates that we see, they don't have that. And that seems like a shame to me.
Yeah, and it's often, with the major developments that happen, unfortunately, the communal space or the public space are the things which disappear first. And, we hear about settlements being planned in greenbelts and various other places. To do that, you have to provide absolutely everything that people would need living there. No more important than right now, because we're almost, because of what's happening with COVID, we're all becoming much more localized. We've gone from, the big picture, the globalized picture, down to a much more localized picture, and we're relying much more heavily on local business now. And I think that's a really important point, and one which planning policy can address quite simply, really.
Absolutely. And Steve, if a developer approached you for a project that was similar to Port Sunlight in terms of its what it offered in terms of the housing and the facilities, how difficult would that be to get planning approval for under the current system? What would your job be made particularly difficult if that scheme was brought to you?
I mean, I guess the difference with Port Sunlight is it was obviously built in the late 1800s, so it was pre the Town and Country Planning Act, pre Greenbelt constraints, etc. Obviously, today we are very much sort of plan-led, plan-driven, and as part of that, we do have numerous planning policies to satisfy. Alongside that, obviously, as well, is the viability of schemes to make sure that they stack up for the developers. So if somebody came to me with a concept of a Port Sunlight, it would be very exciting to work on something like that, because it is a unique type of development. I don't think necessarily we will get that now, mainly because of the way planning policy is driving forward development, and the way it is now a plan-led system from what it was previously.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of Robert Jenrick, obviously the housing secretary, one of his main points from the planning white paper was he wants to back more beautiful buildings, and I'll say that in inverted commas, obviously, because that's beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Do you think that these planning reforms, Steve, could result in more quote beautiful developments? Maybe not to the extent of Port Sunlight, but certainly more than the cookie cutter estates that we see presently.
Yeah, you would hope so. I mean, I support good design. That's what we all strive for in the industry, and I don't think there's any reason why else we shouldn't target high quality, good design. I think, to be fair, most people who I certainly work with do so anyway
Yeah.
already. I think in terms of the design code initiative, which is obviously something we can talk about a bit more, that is a step in the right direction in terms of bringing about good quality design. I guess the key is making sure that's not too prescriptive and therefore does actually restrict the ability to sort of architectural license and flair to create innovation and a diverse range of developments. So I think it's going to be very much the devil's in the detail, and I know the government is bringing forward a national model design code to direct the preparation of design codes. So much will depend on what is included in that document when it comes forward.
Absolutely. And Simon, speaking about architectural flair, there, um, do you feel under the current system that you have sort of sufficient freedom to design, or do you feel restricted by the current planning system?
I mean, I think generally, I feel that the planning policy, plan-led system is restrictive. I think no more now than it's ever been. Really, I think the focus is very much on restricting development, um, and it depends from council to council how they actually deal with design. You get some councils who are quite, and some officers who are just quite happy to let you lead on design because you're effectively a designer, whereas others, there seems to be a little bit more, they want to get a bit more involved in the design in inverted commas, and often that simply means materials, and the issue that we have is there's really no policies that aren't very very subjective, which lead to um, some kind of design framework, and so we very much design blind in that respect, and I think a change would be welcome, certainly. I think that the worry is if it's too restrictive, you're going to end up with very much, very similar proposals and schemes in the same areas, and that's a real worry, really, from a design perspective, because, like with Port Sunlight, variety is very much what attracts a lot of people to it, and it's important to have that variety in terms of look, detail, scale, massing. That's what, if you think of, a lot of the places in the world which work very well as town planning and as beautiful places, they have that variety. They're not all the same, and at the moment, I'm afraid that planning policy doesn't really allow for that flexibility.
Yeah. And thinking now a bit more about the proposed planning reforms, we'll go. I'll ask you, Steve, in a moment to explain those in sort of layman's terms, in terms of what it's going to mean.
Mm-hmm.
If that's not too much of an ask. Um,
No
but
problem.
firstly, I'm going to ask you both this question, and it's this. So the planning reforms have been talked about a lot recently. They've been described in a multitude of different ways. Here's a few words: shameful, welcome, long overdue, radical. Simon, we'll start with you. What's the truth?
Well, at the moment, we don't really have, in terms of the planning for reforms, we only really have a very basic white paper to work off. I think the aspiration is good, but I think what's maybe been underestimated is how um, the issues run right through the system, right from the top all the way down. And obviously, we deal with planning officers day to day. All they can do is work off the framework that they're given, the planning policies that they're given, and this is a problem. And the new reforms, say all the right things, and in theory should work brilliantly if it's done properly. But since the last planning reforms, I think it's still only 50% of councils have a current up-to-date plan in place, which is adopted. So how are we going to a wholesale reform of the system and the policies? How is that going to work? And is it actually going to be able to get adopted this time?
And Steve, same question to you. What's your perception of what you've read from the white paper?
Well, I think of those descriptions that you read out, Dan, I would probably say I'm more in the welcome camp. I think there are some positive measures set out within the white paper. Obviously, we need more detail on some of them. But what the white paper does do is effectively expand on some of the key themes which are already set out in the MPPF, and really designed to deliver a faster and simpler planning system. That's what it sets out to achieve. And one that also looks to stimulate growth on the back of obviously the issues of COVID that we're all encountering. Now, to achieve that, they've included in the white paper 3 key pillars as they see them, all of which obviously need to work in harmony to make sure that what they're setting out to deliver can actually be achieved. Now, one of those pillars is planning for development, which focuses on the plan making system, which Simon's just been talking about. And that does very much look to streamline the plan making system from what at the moment could be anything between 4 to 7 years or longer in some cases, to something which should only take between 30 to 42 months. Now, that would be a big benefit if that can be the case, and the intention is to streamline those by removing a lot of the policies which are included within these documents, the sort of general policies, so that local plans can instead just focus very much on sites which will come forward for development and having site-specific policies to achieve that. And then alongside that, they've obviously got the other pillars, one of which is the planning for beautiful and sustainable places. So it's just important that they all work together to ensure that we do get that faster and simpler planning system ultimately.
Absolutely. You said there about site-specific policy. Could you explain what that might look like under the new reforms if they are indeed adopted?
So, I mean, you do have that at the moment in some local plans. You'll have a large strategic site which is allocated for so many dwellings or different land uses. And within that, there will be specific criteria on the amount of open space that's needed or access requirements or off-site contributions. So it will provide that detail and a bit more clarity, I guess, as to what is going to be needed from that development. Now, whether that will go down to design as well, we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, as we're talking about, we don't want that to be too prescriptive in terms of what can then come forward, particularly on a large development site, because the last thing we all want is a scheme of 1,000 units with every house looking the same necessarily. So I think that'll be important, and obviously there'll be some flexibility for local authorities to prepare those policies in consultation with the development industry.
And Simon, sorry, how much more enjoyable and productive would your job be if these design codes were adopted?
Well, I suppose the $1,000,000 question is, it depends what they entail, but I think, the more that we can agree, I suppose, a framework of design. I mean, really, all we want to deal with is design in terms of the planning process. The more things which can be dealt with, in a sort of consultation prior to an actual application in a wider sense, in a more strategic policy sense. So you apply for a planning application on a brownfield site in the middle of, let's say, Birkenhead down the road. It's already established that it can be used for housing, commercial, and a number of other uses, and it can be up to a certain amount of stories. It can be a certain type of building, and then they're all sort of deferred and already pre-agreed. And when you apply for planning, really all you're dealing with is actually what the building looks like and how it functions. That would be an awful lot easier for the planning officer, for one, certainly, because they're having to deal with the principle of development on every single scheme. But also, it focuses on the important stuff, which is how the building functions and what it looks like and how it segues really into its surrounding context. And that's really where the time should be spent in the planning process. rather than trying to establish whether housing is acceptable. Whether
sorry.
Go on. No, sorry.
No, just putting in there, Simon. One of the things they are looking to do is obviously introduce and identify growth areas in local plans moving forward, which would be for large scale development where there's a permission in principle effectively for outline permission granted through the local plan allocation. It would then be a case of going on to the effectively the reserve matters application, where the detail will come through the design code. But if on one hand through the growth areas you're looking to accelerate that approval process, the last thing we then want through the design code process is to then just cause delay further down the line. So it's important, therefore, that the design codes work in the right way in that extent.
And I think that, I suppose that's what we're a bit worried about, and the elephant in the room really is design itself is extremely subjective. And everyone's opinion is different. What we'll design is different from another architect, obviously. What we'll design is different from the idea that the planner had, maybe. And this is where the issues come along. The amount of applications we make, and I think we're pretty good at design, but the amount of applications we make and the consultees don't like the design, it happens every time. And even on buildings which we finished, and then eventually people have said, well, this looks great. We got a lot of grief on the design at the early stage. So just from those few examples, design is hugely subjective, and it's something we've spent a lot of time learning how to do and trying to understand.
Absolutely.
And I think go on.
I think you hire an architect to design your development, don't you? That's their job, and they should be left to do that. And this sort of feeds into a debate that's been rumbling on among architects for a while now about not being involved or as involved in the process as perhaps they should be. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I suppose the whole influx of design build contracting and procurement has kind of left us out a little bit in the important parts, which is delivering the design. And we spend an awful lot of time thinking and designing and agreeing principles with planners, and then often, or sometimes, we're not involved in the actual delivery of that design, and it gets done separately. And I think, firstly, that's something I'd like to be involved in every scheme that we design, so that we can control when things change, I suppose, because things have to change sometimes. But also, I'd like to see an architect involved in every scheme that gets designed from scratch, and unfortunately, that's not always the case. And I think design should be front and centre of a planning policy, of a planning system. My concerns are how that is actually rolled out and how it's controlled without it being someone's opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And to go back to what you were talking about just a moment ago about having those pre-application discussions and making them carry a bit more weight in terms of the design, so that you can then focus later down the line on the sort of the nitty-gritty. And I guess this is all part of how you might streamline the process, I suppose.
Yeah, and I suppose it's quite similar to a building regulation system, or the building control system at the moment. You have a robust set of plans, which are the approved documents. You apply for your plan approval, you get that, hopefully, and then it sets out a number of conditions which you have to satisfy afterwards, all in line with what you've already submitted, and it's almost self-approving in many ways. Hence, the building control system has been able to go down the approved inspectors route. I'm not necessarily suggesting that's appropriate for planning. I think there's too much riding on it, but I think the more you can agree at pre-app stage as a formal pre-app, which has a formal decision, I suppose, can ultimately make everyone's life a lot easier, not only the planning officer, who then has to deal with less things on a full application, almost as Steve said before, reserve matters. So, I think there are ways like that to minimize the amount of time that planning applications are taking at the moment, because with all the targets in the world, Steve, how many of your applications get dealt with within time?
Oh yeah, very few. Yeah, yeah, and that's not a criticism of the officers either. It's
No,
just the process really, and
it is. Yeah.
so many people have to be consulted, and external consultees as well. And I know there's some councils who have already got design codes etc. in place, and whilst it does hopefully go about and deliver better quality design, it doesn't necessarily translate into a quicker process.
Mm.
And you can end up being bogged down in the detail even more. So, as there's differences of opinion as to what should be the appropriate design for that area, well, we've got this guy that says this thing, and the architect's got their own opinion, and the developer's
Mm.
got their own opinion. So, it's how that's all brought together really and controlled in an efficient manner. I do think engagement is going to be key. Both sort of in the plan making process for design codes themselves, and communities are encouraged to get involved. So how's that process managed? And then,
Yeah.
at the decision taking stage as well, it's important that members as well are aware of what process has gone through to arrive at the scheme that's on the table.
Yeah, and I think the best places that we've worked in terms of local authorities are those authorities who've gone through the housing land assessment process, who've consulted on it, who've adopted it, and then when you actually submit a planning application and it's already been accepted for housing in that process, it's deemed almost acceptable, the principle, and it just cuts away so much of the objection and discussion that takes place, because there's already been the opportunity for locals to comment on that and it's been adopted. So you take that off the table, and then you're really only dealing with a much more streamlined set of issues to get approval for, and it makes a huge difference. That
Yeah, absolutely. Talking about consultation there with the public, th- a couple of weeks ago we ran an article about some local authorities in Greater Manchester, specifically Salford and Oldham, and I think Stockport as well have sort of chimed in with this, who are basically against the proposed planning reforms.
yeah,
Oldham Council called them fundamental. Said they fundamentally undermine democratic local control. And I guess, Steve, that sort of points to what you just said, that how important consultation is going to be in order to keep that scrutiny and democratic element to the process.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, the plan making process, the local plan making process, will still remain very similar to what it is today. It will still go through the examination process. It's just very much designed to be a quicker process than what it is now, and making sure that local authorities do meet the timescales which are put forward. And there is talk of sanctions if they don't. Not sure what those sanctions would be, but I don't think much changes necessarily in that regard. And I think that's important, sort of moving forward with the public as well, because clearly they're going to be expected to have quite an active role in other elements of plan making, such as design codes, where they're going to be getting asked what do they view to be sort of the popular and characteristic elements of their community, and it begs the question. And if you don't get enough buy-in or involvement from communities in things like the design code making, then what weight can they carry? So I don't think the reforms do away with engagement at all. I think there's going to be emphasis on local authorities to make sure that they've got the measures in place and resources in place, which obviously they need support on, to make sure that they do go about that proactively.
and I think the important word to focus on from what you said in that quote, Dan, is the word control. And yes, we talk about planning control, but I think too often the word control means restriction rather than facilitating control within guidelines or within the local plan. And very much we feel that the planning system is simply restricting development now. It's trying to reduce it as much as possible, when actually what's required is the opposite.
Absolutely, absolutely. We do need to talk about councils. These guys are going to be the gatekeepers to any change that's going to come about in the planning system, because everything goes through them. So I guess change will only come about as quickly as they can adapt. Simon, what are you hopeful that they will be able to adapt to a new system and as a result, the planning system will become more bearable for people using it?
In a word, the first question: are local authorities going to be able to adapt? I, at the moment, I'm a little bit negative about that because, as I mentioned before, a lot of them haven't even been able to bring in a new local plan within the last 10 or 15 years, up to 50% at the moment. So to go through a whole other process of policy for everything is going to be a huge challenge for local authorities, and they need to be given the time to be able to do it. And a lot of these, I mean, feel free to interject, Steve, but it feels like a lot of the local plan issues in terms of adoption have been as a result of the housing assessments and ultimately consultation.
Yeah, and I think obviously, there's. I'm not going to name any authorities, obviously, but some are under more pressure than others to get a plan in place. But the lack of any sort of sanctions really in the past has probably meant that they've not been as keen to do so as what we would all like. I think that's what the government now is looking to introduce in terms of this 30 to 42 months to get it in place. That is, potentially much quicker than what it has been done in the past. That is going to need a change from officers, but also from at a political level. That they're going to have to embrace change ultimately, and they're going to have to accept change. And sometimes the criticisms that we're getting is because they simply don't want to embrace change within their area, and it does mean difficult decisions have to be made. But ultimately, that's what's required at the end of the day to achieve the government's target, for 300,000 homes a year nationally, and to bring about this faster and simpler planning system.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, planners and planning officers need to focus on what they're qualified to do, and that's planning. And at the moment, because the system is so complex and so focused on administration, this is touched on in the white paper about using more modern methods of communication and having digital plans and various other things. This can all help. There's no doubt about that. We need to get back to local authorities and individual planning officers being able to actually do their jobs, and they're not being allowed to do that at the moment based on the current system. That's ultimately the issue, I think, and policy has a huge role to play in that. In fact, it's all down to policy, and separating some of the key issues for a site to be sort of pre-approved, so that the planners can focus on that side of it is I think integral to how this comes forward. Otherwise, I don't think anything will change.
And I think that's partly behind the sort of the standard method that the government is introducing for councils to calculate their housing requirements, and making those requirements a binding requirement, so that debate about housing numbers, and there will be still some debate, but it is diminished in terms of this is what you now need to go and deliver.
Yeah,
and they have to look at that positively and go and make those decisions.
Yeah, yeah. And then just to just go back to I think it was the second question regarding consultation. I suppose there's two different types of consultation we talk about. There's the consultation for the planning policy documents, which is obviously the public plus all the other stakeholders, and then there's consultation in regards to individual planning applications. And at the moment, whilst I'm all for consultation, there's far too much weight applied to, I suppose, what we call negative consultation, and it's restrictive consultation and the whole NIMBYism argument, and often far too much weight is given to that. Everyone's entitled to an opinion, of course they are, but those opinions have to be aligned with policy, and too often they're not, but they're still given weight. I mean, Steve, when was the last time you had a petition in favour of a development, for instance?
A long time.
Exactly, but you get one against it for virtually every application.
Yes, yeah. I think it is that's an important element, isn't it, in terms of the planning balancing exercise that goes on. It's perhaps easy to, if you get one or two objections from consultees, to go with those objections rather than necessarily weigh up, the schemes as a whole and the wider benefits. So I think that does need careful consideration still moving forward. And I
Yeah.
guess it begs a question as well on going back to the design code element. If we bring forward a scheme that is, say, I don't know, 70-80% compliant with that design code, but not fully, where does that then sit in the
Yeah.
planning balance versus other benefits that might be alongside it? So I guess
Exactly.
that'll play out, I guess, in due course.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should very quickly mention something that is a very divisive topic, and that's the green belt. Recently, some Stockport councillors lodged a motion to withdraw from the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework. One of the reasons was that they said that it was against their sort of brownfield first approach. Obviously, greenbelt land will be protected under the new system, but do you envision, Simon and Steve as well, more greenbelt development under the new planning reforms? Potentially, there's got to be some kind of concession there, hasn't there?
Yeah, definitely. And myself and Steve have been involved recently in a number of greenbelt schemes, which we would always say don't make it any worse as what's there, and hopefully add to the green belt and the enjoyment of the green belt. And there obviously has to be robust policies in place to protect that. It's arguably one of the most important elements of planning policy. The protection of the green belt is a huge asset to the country. But at the same time, I think we need to move away from this sort of blanket green belt policy. The green belt, as a lot of people envisage it, is a lovely big field with maybe a really old oak tree sat in the middle of it, and on a lovely summer's day. That's not the whole green belt, and there's a lot of parts of the green belt which are suitable for development within strict and much stricter regulations than in a town centre, and rightly so. There's brownfield sites within the green belt. A lot of people don't realise that, and I think they're suitable for development, and they can contribute positively to a number of policies, council policies, ultimately.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
Steve, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, my view is obviously, the green belt is there to be protected, and that is what policy looks to do. But ultimately, moving forward, it's inevitable that some areas and local authorities are going to have to release greenbelt land moving forward to meet their future housing requirements. And when those requirements, as I say, become a binding requirement, it is therefore going to perhaps focus the minds a little bit more. And as Simon says, not every parcel of greenbelt land is of the same value as others, and there are brownfield parcels in there as well which can be released. And I think people still need to realise that if one or two greenfield sites are released, there's still masses of greenbelt land still remaining, for people to enjoy. So, I think it's inevitable it will have to happen still, but it will be very much through the plan making process.
Okay. And I think that's, sorry, Dan, but I think that's the important point. That the local plans have the ability to have a say on this and to set their own policies and requirements for development in the green belt. This is the opportunity to do it, and by not doing it, you're missing a chance to do it. And Cheshire West nearly fell foul of that a few years ago when they were suffering from a number of appeals in and around places where Steve sat right now, I suppose, which were being overturned at appeal because there just wasn't that robust plan in place to say that we can build the houses that we can and we're required to. So I think it's an opportunity for councils and for people who write local plans to control this now. And I use the word control positively there, because within the green belt it is a positive use, and it has to be protected.
Absolutely. We'll draw things to a close shortly. I've just got one more question. So, with the planning reforms, they're very much focused on boosting housing numbers. 300,000 new homes a year was the figure that Genric put forward. Is there a worry that with the streamlining of this planning process, that it could be in favour of volume house builders who build developments lacking in character, or do you think it could open the door for more creative and more beautiful homes, as Jenrick has said. Simon, what do you think about that?
I hope it would. I'm still a little bit skeptical about the detail of what's going to come out of the emerging policy, and I think what we need to avoid is arguably what planning in the USA has fallen foul of, with large cookie cutter estates, tract housing, and various other things. And I think the planning system and the planning officers have a larger role to play in this, in terms of larger schemes, house builder schemes. It's no secret that house builders use the same house types for virtually every site, whether it's in Leamington Spa or whether it's in Birkenhead, and how they clad those and how they furnish those is slightly different for each. And I've been an architect. I always come from a point of site-specific architecture, and it should change for virtually every site. So how policy reflects that, I don't know. I don't have the answer. But I would love to see some policies which, I suppose, encourage. We use the word beautiful. I'm not quite wholly comfortable with in the way it's being used, but to follow on that, to create beautiful housing estates and infill developments.
Absolutely. Steve, what are your thoughts?
Well, obviously, there's a balance to be struck, isn't there? Because the government set itself a target of 300,000 homes a year. To do that, we can't just rely on the house builders alone. We do need sort of SMEs in the marketplace to come forward as well and make sure that they can still deliver. What we don't want to see, therefore, is a design process or a design code process which actually has implications on the viability of schemes and profit margins, such that the SMEs think, actually, you know what, we're not sure it makes profitable sense for us to actually do this. We're not going to make any money on it, and then we're reliant on the volume house builders who naturally have their standard product, which works for them. And again, then if they're asked to change their design concepts, does that impact on them? Does it impact on the rate of delivery? Which ultimately what this is all aimed at, to accelerate delivery. So, it's going to be interesting. I haven't got the answer at the moment, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because it needs a careful consideration to make sure that, they, as I said at the start, that they all work in harmony, really, to bring about what the government wants to achieve.
Yeah. And there's a lot of compromise as well, as you've just alluded to. It's there's always a compromise in terms of design because of cost. Cost is always an issue for developers. And what we often say is, what I feel one of our skills is, Paddock Johnson's skills, that is being able to design to different budgets. And it would be wonderful to have a blank checkbook and create beautiful spaces and places all the time. And we always strive to do that, obviously, on no matter what budget we have. And I think that has to be a consideration as well, because you've got the housing numbers to satisfy, you've got your own design codes to satisfy, and you've got the developers' requirements to satisfy often. And they all have to be very carefully balanced, and often we sit within the middle of all that, almost negotiating with each side to get the best scheme out of it.
Yeah, absolutely, really interesting. I think that was a very insightful discussion. Lots of things to go away and think about there, and obviously we wait with bated breath to see the devil in the detail that everyone is so eager to see in terms of these planning reforms. Simon and Steve, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks, Dan.
No, thank you, Dan.
That's all for today's episode. I'd like to say a big thank you to Paddock Johnson for sponsoring this podcast. Thank you to our guests, Simon Halliwell and Steve Grimster, and thank you for listening. I've been your host, Dan Whelan, and I hope you can tune in next time for another episode of the Place Northwest podcast.